Hey guys, what's up? It's Eric with Advanced Level Automotive. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another video. Now, some of you guys might recognize this car right behind me. It's a 2008 Chevrolet Cobalt. It's got the 4-cylinder 2.2 liter engine. And in the last video, we diagnosed why we had a misfire on cylinder number 2. Now, if you guys have not watched that video, I will leave a link down in the description below. Make sure you go watch that before continuing this one. Now, for those of you that did watch the video, you'll know that we found out that we had a leaking exhaust valve on cylinder number 2. And so basically on today's video, our goal is to remove the cylinder head so that we can see what happened inside the engine. We don't exactly know what we're dealing with, whether it's a bent valve or maybe a bad valve seat. But either way, all we know is that we definitely have to remove the cylinder head. Hopefully it's something we can repair here without having to send the head off to the machine shop. If it's something like a bent valve, as long as the valve seat is not damaged or the valve guide, then we can probably just replace the exhaust valve and get this thing running as cheaply as possible. Now, if it is a bent valve, we also have to take into consideration that we might have an issue where the timing chain jumped. And so if that's the case, we're definitely going to have to go in there, replace the timing chain, the tensioner, the guide, and all of the rest of the components that are involved with the timing chain. It's probably a good idea to do that anyway if we're going to be inside the engine. So anyway, now that you guys are all caught up, let me take you over to the engine and show you what we're working with. So here we have our 2.2 liter 4-cylinder Ecotec engine. In order for us to remove the cylinder head, we're going to start by removing this air box. We're also going to remove the intake manifold, the valve cover, the exhaust manifold, the front timing cover, and everything else that's associated with us removing the cylinder head. I'm pretty eager to see what kind of damage we have inside the engine. So I'm going to go ahead and pull it into the garage and start tearing this thing apart. Alright guys, so we managed to get the valve cover removed. Also got the intake manifold removed. I'm in the process right now of removing the exhaust bolts. Now what I'm going to do is, rather than unbolting the manifold from the head, I'm going to just go ahead and remove these 3 nuts on the exhaust flange down here. Now I did soak them with PB Blaster penetrant fluid. They've been soaking for about an hour now. However, these nuts still don't want to break loose. They're pretty rusted on there, so I think what I'm going to do is use my torch over here, heat those bolts up, and then hopefully they'll come loose. The last thing I want to do is break any exhaust studs. Now with the valve cover out of the way, we can see our timing chain up here. This is our exhaust cam sprocket and this is our intake cam sprocket. Now honestly, I was kind of halfway expecting this chain to be really loose, but if you take a look at this thing, you can see that it's actually pretty tight. There's really not a whole lot of play in this chain, and this guide is still intact. Typically when you have a timing chain that's been slapping around because it's loose, this guide here is one of the first things to go. The plastic will crack and fall off because the chain is slapping up against it. But in our case, as you can see, this thing is still fully intact. So I'm not exactly sure if our timing chain was the issue here. I mean, there is a possibility that maybe the valve itself is not bent. Maybe the valve seat came off of the cylinder head. I've run across that before, but really the only way for us to find out is to remove the cylinder head. And because we got to remove the cylinder head anyway, I'm probably going to go ahead and replace all of the timing components while I'm at it. Now, luckily, judging by the way this thing looks, it seems like there's plenty of space here for us to get the timing cover out without having to fight it. So again, like I said, I'm pretty close to getting this head off. I'm going to go ahead and heat those bolts up back there with the torch. Hopefully we can get those exhaust flange nuts off without breaking anything. Then I'm going to remove these 2 big bolts for the cam sprockets, remove the gears, and let the chain drop into the timing cover. We're going to have to remove the timing cover anyway. So now that you guys know where I'm at, let's get back to work. We'll switch over to the other bolt. Heating up that last bolt. Looks good enough to me. Let's see if we can break this thing loose. Now that it's nice and smoking hot, be careful not to touch any of the parts that you just heated up, or really anything around it, because you could really hurt yourself. Now before, when I tried to break these loose, they would not budge even with all my strength, so let's give it a shot now. Okay, let's try it. Again. Oh! Okay. Still pretty stuck on there. Change of plans. I might have to impact it from the bottom. So we managed to get all 3 exhaust nuts off without breaking any of them. That's a win in my book. All right, guys, so one of the things that we have to do before we can actually remove the cylinder head from the engine is remove this bolt plug right here, because there is a bolt behind this plug that holds the timing chain guide, and that bolt is actually bolted into the cylinder head itself. So we have to remove this so that we can remove the bolt behind it. Now, because these plugs can get pretty stuck on there sometimes, we're gonna go ahead and spray it with some penetrant fluid. Now we're gonna go ahead and take our 10mm hex socket and break this thing loose. There we go. There's our plug. Now there's actually an aftermarket version of this plug that replaces the bolt behind it. And so basically what they did was they made the bolt and the plug one piece. I'll show you that when it's time to put this thing together. Now we have access to the 10mm bolt for the guide. Break it loose. Got a little magnet here to catch our bolt in case it falls. Not that it's a big deal because we are removing the timing cover anyway. There's our bolt right there. Now, like I said, the aftermarket bolt, what it does is it actually combines these 2 pieces together. Makes it a lot easier for you to remove this in case you ever have to come back in here and do this job again, which hopefully we don't, but it's nice to have that option. All right, guys, so the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to remove the tensioner for the timing chain, which is located right back here. See this big bolt here? That's going to be our timing chain tensioner. So I'm just gonna use a shallow 32mm socket, which fits right on that bolt. And we'll take our ratchet and break this thing loose. Oh, damn it. Well, it seems like once you break it loose, it comes out pretty easily. I'll just take it out by hand. Oh, shoot. I guess I probably should have expected that. It is a spring-loaded tensioner, so when you guys go to remove that thing, make sure you're careful. Okay, so next up, we can remove this guide up here at the top. We've got 2 10mm bolts. Okay, so next up, we're gonna remove both cam sprockets by removing these 2 big bolts here. Luckily, these camshafts do have a spot for us to put a backup wrench. So I've got a crescent wrench I'm gonna use as a backup. We have an 18mm socket. There we go. Now the next one, loosen this one. There we go. Nice and easy. Now we can go ahead and pull our gears off. Like I said, I'm just gonna let the chain drop into the engine. Not really worried about it. We're gonna be removing the timing cover anyway. Now it looks like we can pretty much start unbolting our cylinder head. If you look along the center here, you're gonna find that we have all of these 15mm head bolts. And so we're gonna have to remove all of these. Now, when we do remove these, we do wanna make sure that we do them starting from the inside, moving out. Now there are just a couple of other bolts. If you look up here in the front, you can see we have these 2 eTorx bolts right here. No big deal, they're pretty easy to get to. And at this point, I don't think we have to remove this engine mount. I mean, eventually we are going to have to remove this engine mount when it comes time to removing the timing cover. But at this point, I really just want to get the cylinder head off. One more thing I forgot to mention is that there is one 10mm bolt back here holding down this ground cable. So we do have to remove that 10mm bolt. And that pretty much looks like everything we need to remove in order to remove the cylinder head. So let's go ahead and bust these bolts off of there. All right, guys, so we've got our cylinder head off of the engine and on our bench over here. Now, I will say, this cylinder head was pretty heavy. It was a lot heavier than I was expecting. Maybe it's because I left the exhaust manifold attached, but if you guys are removing a cylinder head on one of these engines, be prepared because These things are pretty heavy. Now I'm getting ready to remove these camshafts, but before I do that, I wanted to take note of something here. If you guys are ever going to remove these camshafts on these engines, make sure that these caps go back in their same place. Now, luckily, GM was kind enough to label these for us. So if you take a look over here at this cap, it's got a number 1. Now the arrow is indicating that this does face forward toward the front of the engine. And if you move over to the next cap, you can see again, we have the arrow, we have a number 2. Over here, we have a number 3 with the arrow. Over here we have a number 4. Over here we have a number 5. Then moving over to the next camshaft, over here we have a number 6, and we have a number 7, and we have a number 8, 9, and finally a number 10. Now you really can't get the camshafts mixed up because obviously this camshaft is a lot longer than this one. Of course, because we have the reluctor wheel here for the cam sensor. So as long as you put them in the correct orientation, you should be good to go. So let's go ahead and remove these. And again, just like the head bolts, you want to remove them starting in the middle, moving outward. We'll try to keep these in order. Now we'll gently lift the camshaft off of the cylinder head and set it aside. Now the intake cam. Now we'll remove these rocker arms. Make sure you closely inspect all of these after removing them. We can also go ahead and pull out these little hydraulic lash adjusters. I'm just using a little magnet here to pop them out. And then we're just going to carefully inspect each of them to make sure that none of them have collapsed. You want to make sure that if you try to squeeze this with your fingers, it's not going to move, it's not going to budge. It takes a lot of strength to squeeze these things. So just go through and make sure that none of them have collapsed. Now I'm just going to go ahead and flip the cylinder head over and we'll take a look at our valves. All right, so now we can take a closer look at our exhaust valves. If you take a look here at each cylinder, you'll see that the bigger valves are going to be the intake valves and the smaller ones here are going to be the exhaust valves. Looking back, we had a misfire on cylinder number 2, which is going to be this one right here because this is the front of the cylinder head. This is where the timing chain goes through. And so this is going to be our number 2 cylinder. Let's take a close look at these exhaust valves. I don't see anything that immediately sticks out. I mean, I was thinking that we might have had a bent exhaust valve, but we'll take a look here. You can actually see that. Is this valve missing a piece? You guys see that? Or is it just me? No, there's definitely something wrong here. Take a look at this exhaust valve. You see how this one is just perfectly round? And this one over here is round, but when you get down here, you can see that it kind of looks like it's missing a piece. Almost like it either hit something or maybe it melted away. I mean, it's sitting inside of the seat flush, so I don't think there's a problem with the valve being bent, nor does it look like the valve seat fell out. It just looks to me like this thing melted. Let's take a look at the other cylinders. Yeah, see, this one looks pretty good. Both of the exhaust valves are nice and round. Let's take a look at the next one. Same thing here. The valves are nice and round. I don't see any part that's melted. Looks like our problem was specific to cylinder number 2. Well, that's interesting. I wonder if we can just replace that exhaust valve and get away with just doing that. Hopefully there's no damage to the seat, but I guess the only way to find out is for me to pull this valve out. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, guys, so really quick, before I actually remove the exhaust valve, there's something I wanted to show you, a method that I use in order to test for leaky valves. Now, this is something that I learned from my father-in-law, who was an old school mechanic. I worked with him at his shop when I was a teenager. And so this is a method that a lot of old school guys use. And I know some of you guys don't have an old school mentor like I was lucky enough to have. And so I just wanted to take the time real quick to show you. Now what I have over here is a bottle of soapy water. It's basically just a solution of water and dish soap. I always keep this here in my garage. I use it for finding leaks in tires and stuff like that. But basically what I'm gonna do here is I'm going to remove the lid. Then we're just gonna pour some of this soapy water solution into each of these cylinders. Just kind of slowly wanna fill them up here. Don't overfill them. You see how I did that? Just get it as close to the top as you can. And also try to have the head on a level surface. In my case, it would actually help if I had lifted it up here on the backside. So I'm gonna try to slide something underneath it. Okay, so now that we have the cylinder head as level as possible, I'm gonna go ahead and finish pouring water into each of these. you can see that cylinder number 2 is already almost empty. Compare that to the other cylinders, all of these are still full. We're clearly able to see that our problem is specifically with cylinder number 2. The other thing I wanted to show you was how you can use compressed air to help you pinpoint the leak. And so because we're more focused on the exhaust valves, what we're going to do is we're going to put compressed air into the exhaust manifold, and what that's going to do is it's going to pressurize the back of the exhaust valves. Then we're going to look to see if there's any bubbles coming out of these valves. So I'm just going to place this rag over the hole, push some air through it. So obviously we're leaking, but let me try to see which valve it is that's leaking here. You guys see that? Looks like it was coming out of this one. So hopefully you guys can use this method when it comes to testing cylinder heads for leaky valves. Now I got to pull these valves out of this head. All right guys, so in order for us to remove these valve springs up here, I'm going to be using this special tool made by Lisle. If you guys are interested, I will leave a link down below in the description. Basically what this is it's got a magnet inside of this tube, and we're going to put this up here on top of the valve spring. Then I'm just going to take a hammer and give it a few whacks. Well, it looks like one whack is all it took. And so when I lift this up, you'll be able to see that we have the washer that goes on top of the valve spring. And then if you look inside, you can see that we have our 2 little retainers there. Now we can go ahead and remove the valve spring, inspect it visually, make sure that it isn't broken or cracked in any way. The spring looks pretty good to me, so we'll set that aside. One quick tip I forgot to mention is that when you are using this Lisle tool, what you're going to want to do is whatever cylinder you're working on, you're going to want to take something like a rag, place it in that cylinder, and then drop it back down on the table. That's going to give it the support that it needs when you go to hammer down on it. Now we can just push the valves out from the backside, and there is our first exhaust valve, the one that we had a problem with that looked like it melted. And if you guys take a close look at it, you can see that as I spin it, it looks round until I get to about that point right there. You can see that it's got a pretty obvious flat spot, and so that is where our valve melted. Let me go ahead and pop the rest of these out, and then we'll take a look at the valve seats. There's the other one, and finally this third one here. Okay, so we're going to start by taking a look at cylinder number 2 and our problematic exhaust valve that melted. Now, if you take a look at the valve seat, you can actually see that right along this edge right here is where the valve was not seating. Because if you take a look at the rest of the valve seat, you can see it's nice and shiny all the way around, except we have this dark patch right here. Now, after taking a close look at this valve seat, we can tell that it's actually in pretty good shape. We don't have any chunks missing out of it. There's no cracks or pitting. And so at this point, I don't see any reason to replace this valve seat. It looks like we can pretty much just clean this thing up, replace the exhaust valve, and give it a nice good lapping. Now, taking a look at the one next to it, again, we have this nice shiny ring going all the way around. It looks like this valve was sealing okay. Now, I'm probably going to go ahead and replace this exhaust valve as well, just because these were both in the same cylinder. But I think that after we give these a good lapping, they should seal pretty good. Now, taking a look at the valve seat next to it on our cylinder number 3. Again, this is the one that we noticed had a small leak whenever we put compressed air into the exhaust manifold. And so if you take a close look at it, you can see that this valve seat is actually in pretty good shape as well. There's no cracks, no pitting. I'm pretty confident that if we give this thing a good lapping, it should seal right up. All right, guys, so fast forward, I managed to pick up a couple of these exhaust valves at my local auto parts down the street. And so if you take a look here, this is one of our brand new exhaust valves, looking nice and shiny. What we're going to be using to lap our exhaust valves is going to be this valve grinding compound that I got from Permatex. I've had this particular one sitting in my toolbox for a while. That's the part number 837. And if you guys are interested in picking up a tube of this, I will leave a link in the description down below. Now, before we actually get to lapping the valves, the first thing I like to do is just take a wire brush on a drill and just give them a good quick cleaning. Not a whole lot. It doesn't take much to clean these up. Take a look at that valve seat. You can see that it's nice and shiny. We got rid of all of that crud. So I'm just going to take a little bit of this lapping compound and we're going to put it on the edge of the valve. We'll just drop it right into place like so. Now, this is where you have the option to do this a couple of different ways. For one, you could use a tool like this, which is basically just a little suction cup on a stick, and you stick it onto the valve like this, and then you do your hand motion like you're trying to start a fire. that's not the method that I'm going to be using today. I'm going to be using the hose and the drill method, which I'll show you here in just a second. However, before I do that, I want to warn you that this technically might not be the correct way to do this. Honestly, I don't recommend doing it this way unless you have a lot of experience and you take your time with it, because really, if you do this method, you got to do it gently. Otherwise, you run the chance of burning up the valve seat. Now, personally, I've been doing this method for the past 2 decades, and I've never messed up a cylinder head. But like I said, if you're a rookie, stick to using one of these. Okay guys, so as you can see, I've got the head sitting up vertically on my workbench. And if you look over here on the top side of the cylinder head, I went ahead and I took a rubber hose and I connected it to the tip of the valve stem. Now, if you follow this hose, you can see that I have it attached to the chuck on my drill. And so basically what I'm doing here is I'm using the drill to spin our valve, and then I'm gonna pull it back and gently use the drill to grind into our valve seat. Again, you guys see how I'm doing this really gently, not applying a lot of pressure. Take a look at that valve seat. Looks great. We have a nice even streak that goes all the way around it. If we look at the valve here, you can see that we have a nice even pattern going all the way around it. It looks like we did a pretty good job. All right guys, so I've got our exhaust valve installed along with our new valve stem seal. Now, to install the valve stem seal, I basically just use a socket like this with a hammer. So now that we have the valve installed, I'm gonna show you guys how to use the same Lisle tool to install the valve spring and the retainers. So I'm gonna set the valve spring down, then we'll lay our washer on top of it. Then we're gonna take our 2 retaining clips. Make sure of the orientation because these are tapered. It's got to look something like that, bigger at the top and smaller at the bottom. So let's go ahead and set these in place. Now we're going to take the same handle, and it has this attachment piece right here. And if you look, we have this little spring nipple on the end of it. Well, that's going to help us guide our retainers into place while we push down on this thing. So if we line this thing up, make sure you're lined up properly with it, and then we're basically just going to push down on it. You really got to put some muscle in on this thing. And that did not work for us the first time, so let's try it again. Sometimes it takes a few tries. You get it? Nope. Okay, we'll try it again. Also, sometimes it helps if you wiggle it around a little bit. Huh. This one's giving me a little trouble. We are not giving up on this.
1 hour later.
All right, guys, so after many attempts, I finally realized that it wasn't going to work with this tool. Now, that isn't to say that this isn't a good tool. I've owned this thing now for probably a decade, and I've done many cylinder heads and replaced many valves, installed many valve retainers using this tool here. And I've only ever run into a handful of times that I couldn't use this to install the retainers. I don't know if it's something about the depth of this pin here or the design of the washer on top of the spring. All that I know is that this thing didn't work for us this time. So I had to settle for using the good old C-clamp spring compressor. I'm gonna do the same thing to these other 2. We're gonna lap them, clean them up, install new valves. Then we're gonna redo the leak test.
1 hour later.
Let's go ahead and pour in our soapy water. So we're just gonna let this sit, and we'll come back in, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes or so. All right guys, so fast forward. It's now been roughly 20 minutes or so. Take a look, you can see that none of these have gone down. They're all holding water really well. So I'm gonna go ahead and shoot some compressed air into it. All right guys, so I don't know if you can hear it, but I am pushing compressed air through the exhaust manifold right now. And as you can see, we have absolutely no bubbles. These exhaust valves are totally sealed. All right guys, so I just wanted to take a quick moment to show you where I'm at. I've got the cylinder head prepped and ready for install. I went ahead and installed the camshafts, got everything torqued down to spec. I also index the cams. Now that's really important. If you are going to be reinstalling a cylinder head, you need to make sure that before you bolt the head down, the camshafts are in the correct position. Now moving over to the engine block, you can see that right now I have the block prepped and ready to go. I basically use a scuffing pad like this along with some brake cleaner. This works really well to get rid of all of the material left over from the old gasket. Another quick tip is that before I install the cylinder head, one of the things I like to do is I like to lightly coat the cylinder walls in fresh motor oil. That's going to help us make sure that these cylinders are lubricated when we first go to crank this thing over. Another tip I like to add is before you install the cylinder head, make sure, and this is a must, go through each of these bolt holes and blow them out with compressed air. You don't want to have any liquid or debris inside of these head bolt holes because that can really throw off your torque. Now, as you can see, I also went ahead and I removed the timing cover. I've already got the timing chain removed. Now, this here is the balance shaft chain. I'm not going to be messing with that. It's still in really good shape, so we're not touching it. Okay, so we're just about ready to install the cylinder head, but first we need to lay down the head gasket. Now, be careful to pay attention to the orientation of this head gasket. If you look right over here, you can see that it says up. That's letting you know that this side of the gasket faces upward. All right, guys, so we got the cylinder head bolted down and torqued to spec. Now, what I wanted to show you guys was the positioning of the cams. Like I mentioned before, when you install the head, you got to make sure that these camshafts are in the correct position. So if you take a look at these cam sprockets, this here is the exhaust cam and this is the intake cam. And if you look over here on the exhaust side, it actually says exhaust right here and it has a timing mark on this tooth. This is the position you want it to be in. If you take into account the flat surface of the cylinder head, you can see that our triangle is pointing to somewhere around the 10 o'clock position. Then likewise on the intake gear, you can see we have a little diamond. And if you look closely, it says intake. So this is the position you want the intake cam in. Again, if you look at this timing mark and compare it to the plane surface of the cylinder head, this is going to be somewhere around the 2 o'clock position. So if you look at them like this, the exhaust is pointing here and the intake is pointing here. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove these gears so that we can install the timing chain. All right, guys, real quick, I just wanted to show you, this is the bolt that replaces not only the bolt for the guide, but also the plug. Now, if you guys are interested in this, here's the part number. It's made by Dorman. It's a 917954. And so basically what this does is it makes it a lot easier the next time you need to pull off the cylinder head because you don't have to worry about dropping the little 10mm bolt inside of the crankcase. So I'm going to go ahead and install it. Make sure that the guide is lined up properly. If you do need to move it slightly, like in our case, it's a little bit off, you can always use a screwdriver through the top here and try to adjust it while you install it. Just going to use a screwdriver to nudge the guide over a little bit so I can line this thing up. Right there. Now we can screw it down. Now we can torque it down to 59 foot-pound. Now let's go ahead and double check our timing marks. I'm going to remove these zip ties that I use to help me keep the chain in place during install. Okay, so starting up here at the top, our intake camshaft. If you take a look here, this is where you're going to find the uniquely colored link. In this case, our link is actually in between two yellow links. Now moving over to the exhaust. Over here we have the blue link lined up with our timing mark. Then finally the crankshaft. Our colored link is lined up right at the timing mark on the crank gear. So our timing is spot on. Now we can torque down the rest of the guide bolts, install the timing chain tensioner, install the upper guide, and then torque down these cam bolts. All right, guys, so real quick, something I wanted to show you. This here is our brand new timing chain tensioner. Now, if you ever receive your timing chain tensioner in the activated state, like in this case, we've got spring pressure behind this little piston here. Now, if this ever happens to you, it's no big deal. We can always fix it. Let me show you how we're gonna do it. We're gonna start by removing the snap ring here. So we're gonna put it into our vise. We're just gonna pop this snap ring out. There you go. Ow! Fudge! Pull this plunger out. And here on the end of the plunger is where we have our locking mechanism. So we're gonna push down on this while we turn it. It might be easier with some gloves. Okay, let's try that again. We'll push down and then we'll turn as we push down. And this thing should lock into place. Oh man, that is not easy to do. I'm gonna try to use the edge of the vise here. Okay, so that worked. Okay guys, so that was not easy to do by hand using my fingers. So what I did was I used this little notch right here and I stuck it on the corner of the vise here, which you can see I have it covered with the rag. But basically, I used the edge of the vise here to fit right onto that spot. I applied some downward pressure with my hand and then I spun it. And this thing worked really well to hold it in place. Anyway, now that this thing is locked down, we can go ahead and reassemble it. I'm gonna add a little bit of fresh motor oil to this O-ring seal. We'll just lubricate the whole body. And we'll slide it back in. Now we can reinstall the snap ring. Make sure your snap ring is fully seated. So there we have our tensioner, nice and deactivated. Let's go ahead and install this thing and put the rest of this car back together. Okay guys, so we got the tensioner installed. I also went ahead and installed this upper guide. Now it's time to activate the tensioner. And the way we're gonna do that is by using this pry bar. I'm just gonna slip it down in here. And what I wanna do is I wanna put it up against the timing chain where it rides up against the tensioner guide. So basically we're gonna push on the tensioner guide. And when we push it, that's going to push the piston of the tensioner in, which is going to activate that spring. And when we let go, that piston should spring back out. So I'm gonna go ahead and push on it. And there we have it. So now that we've got the timing chain tensioner activated, I'm gonna go ahead and torque down these cam sprocket bolts, and then we'll put the rest of this back together. All right, guys, fast forward. We finally got everything put back together, getting ready to start this thing up. Now, before we actually start the engine up, the first thing we want to do is we want to crank this engine over without it actually starting. Now, the reason we want to do that is because we want to make sure that we build up oil pressure behind that timing chain tensioner so that when we first crank this thing up, that chain is nice and tight. Now, the way we're going to accomplish cranking the engine over without it starting is by removing the fuel pump fuse. If you take a look over here, you can see that I went ahead and removed our 15 amp fuse. So I'm going to go ahead and crank this thing over for about 30 seconds or so. All right, guys, so I've got the fuel pump fuse reinstalled. Time for the moment of truth. Let's see if this thing starts.
Bam, there you have it, guys. This thing started right up and it's running smooth. Now, if you take a look, you'll see that we've got a lot of smoke coming up from the exhaust. Well, that's because I sprayed a bunch of that penetrant fluid onto the exhaust manifold. So it's gonna take a little while for that stuff to burn off. I've got the garage door wide open, so we've got plenty of ventilation in here. I'm just gonna go ahead and turn on the big fan. But other than that, this thing sounds great. And once it clears up, we'll take it for a test drive.
All right, guys, so really quick, I just wanted to throw this quick tip in here for anyone who might be running into this problem. Now, I got the engine running, and for the most part, it was running pretty well. However, during idle, I did notice a slight misfire, and it was showing up on cylinder number 1. Now, when I went under the hood, it was pretty obvious where the problem was. I sprayed some water in the area of this fuel injector, and I could clearly see that we had a vacuum leak coming from the O-ring on this little cap that goes on the end of the injector. Now, I kind of already suspected a problem with this because I do recall that when I removed this fuel rail, the plastic insulator for our cylinder number 1 injector actually stayed stuck in the cylinder head. It didn't really bother me at first. I just left it in there, and when it came time to reinstall it, I just went ahead and installed the rail with the insulator still in the head. But I kind of had an idea in the back of my mind something just didn't seem right. That's one of the reasons why when I noticed the misfire, I went straight for the fuel injector. If you guys are curious, here's the GM part number. Right there, we got a GM part number and also an AC Delco part number. All right, guys, so before we go on a test drive, I wanted to show you some scan data real quick. Take a look, we have our misfire counters up. So we got 0 misfires all the way across the board. The engine is running right now. If you guys take a look at the instrument cluster, you can see that we don't have a check engine light. So far, everything looks good. Let's take this thing for a test drive. All right, guys, so here we are in the test drive. Now, I haven't been driving very long, but I can tell you right now, this thing feels 100 times better. We no longer have any misfires. The acceleration comes on really nice and smooth. The engine sounds great. I'm really satisfied with this fix. Now, that's not to say that the check engine light might not come back on later for a different reason. If you guys remember, originally we had multiple different codes for different things. I think we had a transmission code. We also had a code for the brake switch. I'm sure those codes might come back, but at this point in time, we fixed what was broken as far as the misfire goes. I'm really happy with the fix, and so it's time to deliver this car back to the customer. We're calling this a fix.